It has been said that pawns are the soul of chess. Even though a pawn is the least valuable piece on the chessboard, the combined strength or weakness of your pawns can be the difference between winning or losing a game. Connected pawns can be very powerful. Let's take a look at some examples. In this position, White's pawns are connected in a row on A2, B2, and C2. Notice that Black's king on A4 will have to make several moves before it can attack any of those pawns. If Black plays bishop to E6, attacking the A2 pawn, notice that White can play A3, moving the pawn out of danger, and Black's king cannot capture the A3 pawn because it's protected by the pawn on B2. The ability of connected pawns to support one another is a powerful resource to have. Let's take a look at this position. Black has two pawns that are doubled on C5 and C6. Neither of these pawns can be protected by the other pawn, and the C6 pawn is frozen because the C5 pawn is in its way. So White can play bishop A4, threatening to capture the pawn on C6, and since it cannot move due to being blocked, White will win the targeted pawn on the next move. Remember, pawns are stronger together and weaker when apart. In this position, Black has pawns on A6 and C6. Since neither pawn can be protected by the other pawn, they are considered isolated pawns and are often targets of attack. Notice White can play king to C5, attacking the C6 pawn, and Black cannot protect the isolated pawn. White also had the option of playing bishop to C4, threatening the pawn on A6. Connected pawns in a group are considered to be one pawn island. The fewer pawn islands you have, the easier it is to protect your pawns. Look at this position. White has pawns on H4, G3, F2, E2, D3, and C4, all connected as one island. Compare this to Black. Black has an isolated pawn on H7, one island, pawns on E7 and F6, a second island, and doubled pawns on C6 and C5, a third island. Notice White can play rook G7, attacking two pawn islands at once by threatening to capture the pawns on H7 and E7. Black's king is able to defend one of these pawns, but not both. After king D7, rook takes H7. As White only has one pawn island, Black's rook can only attack E2 with rook A2, which is easily defended by the White king with king F3. Now that you've learned the strengths and weaknesses of different pawn setups, it's your turn to attack and defend pawn structures. Pawns working together can be an unstoppable force. One of the most powerful pawn formations is the pawn chain. A pawn chain is a group of pawns placed on the same diagonal, where each pawn protects the pawn diagonally in front of it. We call this line of pawns a pawn chain because the pawns are linked together. Look at White's powerful pawn chain in this position, starting from a2 and going up the board all the way to d5. It is very difficult to attack these pawns, as the only weakness in a pawn chain is its base, the only pawn that isn't protected by another pawn, in this case, the a2 pawn. Notice that these pawns control key squares, making it very difficult for Black's light-squared bishop to find good squares to use. When a pawn chain starts moving, look out. In this position, watch how these pawns march up the board, each taking turns protecting one another. After b5, king b7, d7, White is already threatening to promote this pawn into a queen on the next turn. Black prevents this with king c7, and now White plays c6, protecting the pawn on d7, and the pawn chain marches forward. After king d8, White plays b6. The mobile pawn chain marches forward, forcing Black's king off the back rank. After king e7, b7, Black cannot stop White from promoting the pawn into a queen on the next turn. After king d8, b8 equals queen, check. Black's king was no match for White's mobile pawn chain. Do not underestimate the strength of a pawn chain. Even two pawns connected as a pawn chain can outpower a piece as strong as a rook. In this position, Black attacks the pawn on b7 with rook b8. Is White's pawn doomed? Not if White plays a6, forming a pawn chain that will overpower Black's rook. After king f8, White advances the a-pawn with a7, and Black cannot stop White from promoting. Let's take a look at two choices. If Black captures the pawn on b7 with rook takes b7, White simply promotes to a queen and forks the king and rook with a8 equals queen. What if Black doesn't capture the b7 pawn but moves the rook to safety with rook d8? White now advances one of the pawns into a queen, let's say b8 equals queen, and after rook takes b8, White's second pawn recaptures the rook and promotes into a queen with a takes b8 equals queen. Two powerful pawns overwhelm the Black rook. What happens when both sides have pawn chains? Look at this position. White has a healthy pawn chain from f4 to g5 to h6, and Black has a pawn chain on h7 to g6 to f5. How can either side attack these strong pawn chains? Remember, a pawn chain's weakest point is the first pawn in the chain, known as the base of the pawn chain. Since the base isn't protected by a pawn, this is a target to attack. Notice the base of White's pawn chain is f4, protected by White's king. The base of Black's pawn chain, h7, does not have any protection, so White plays bishop to g8. Black is helpless in preventing White's bishop from capturing all of Black's pawns. Let's take a look at one more position together. It is not always practical to attack the base of the pawn chain. Sometimes you have to challenge the pawn chain head-on. In this position, notice Black has a strong pawn chain, b7, c6, d5, e4. White attacks the head of the pawn chain with f3. If Black does nothing, White will win the pawn on e4 on the next move, as the f3 pawn joins both the knight and the queen in attacking the e4 square. Black only has two defenders, the d5 pawn and the f6 knight. After e takes f3, Black's pawn chain is shortened and the head of the pawn chain is no longer taking space in White's territory. After bishop takes f3, White captures the pawn and places pressure on Black's new head of the pawn chain, d5. Now it's your turn to practice attacking with and defending against pawn chains. Have you ever been in an airplane or a car where you felt squeezed for space? Usually the more space we have to move, the better. The same idea applies to chess. The more space we control on the board, the more squares our pieces have to move around, and the less space our opponent's pieces have to use. Notice in this position, white has a massive pawn chain, starting on a2 and moving up the board, b3, c4, d5, e6, f5, g4, and h3. Look at the pawns on d5, e6, and f5. They are already posted on black's side of the board, and with the pawns on c4 and g4, look at all of the squares that these pawns control on black's side of the board. Behind these pawns, white's pieces can freely move around the board. Black's pawns, on the other hand, do not control any space in white's territory, so it is difficult for black's pieces to find active squares to attack white. With white to move, notice how white's rooks are doubled on the g-file, and with the queen on h4, they work together to prepare g5, taking more space on the king side and threatening to open up the g-file with g takes f6 on the next turn, unleashing the powerful doubled rooks on the g-file, pointing directly at black's king. Notice since black's pieces have little room to move around, black's cramped pieces will be no match for white's active forces ready to attack on the king side. In this position, white has two pawns in the center, controlling four important squares on black's side of the board, c5, d5, e5, and f5. Since black does not have any pawns in the center to control central space, white can gain more space while pushing black's developed knights backwards, like this. After e5, white gains space in black's territory and gains a tempo by forcing a developed piece to waste time and move again. Notice black's knight does not have a good square to move to, as e4 is covered by the knight on c3, and d5 is also protected by that knight and white's bishop on c4. Where else could this knight move? After knight g4, since the knight doesn't have any safe squares available, it is trapped after h3. What about knight h5? The knight does not have any safe squares to move to from h5 and is trapped again after g4. Notice that the bishop on c1 controls f4, so the knight cannot escape. This leaves us with knight g8 or knight h7. After knight h7, can you see how white can gain more space and attack another developed piece for black? That's right, d5. White's central pawns push black's developed pieces backwards, so white will enjoy a great space advantage, making it hard for black to develop pieces around these strong pawns on d5 and e5. Let's take a look at one more example together. What should you do when your opponent has a space advantage? Fight back and try to gain space yourself. Look at this position. White has pawns on e4 and d4, just like the last example where black's pieces were pushed backwards. How can black fight back against these space-grabbing pawns? That's right, d5. Black's pawn attacks both the bishop on c4 and white's central pawn on e4. If white retreats the bishop, black will capture white's pawn on e4, breaking up a good part of white's control of the center. And after e takes d5, black has an equal share of the center, and black's light-squared bishop is ready to jump into action on the newly opened h3 to c8 diagonal. Now that you've learned the importance of space, it's your turn to practice fighting for space. The pawns play such an important role in chess. Pawns, when working together, help us both attack and defend. The way the pawns are placed also help direct us like road signs. They tell us where to go and how to handle a position. We're going to look at three main types of positions: open, closed, and semi-open positions. If there aren't a lot of pawns in the center, the position has open files and diagonals. They can be used like open roads for your pieces to travel all over the board. We call these types of positions open. In this position, notice that there are no pawns in the center, so there are a lot of open lines. Even though knights and bishops are generally considered to be worth about the same, in open positions, bishops are often far stronger than knights. The reason why is bishops are long-distance pieces that can travel from one side of the board to the other very quickly. Knights, on the other hand, are short-distance pieces, meaning knights take a longer time to travel across the board. In this position, both of White's bishops are pointing toward the king side. White's light-squared bishop joins the queen on d3 in pointing at h7. With White to move, White can win at least a piece with bishop takes f6, removing the defender of h7 and threatening checkmate on the very next turn. Black must prevent checkmate with a move such as g6. Notice that Black has weakened the dark squares around the king and has opened up the a1 to h8 diagonal. White now has the powerful move bishop to b2, bringing the bishop to a safe square, and now that the dark squares have been opened around Black's king, White's queen is ready to join the dark squared bishop on b2 to threaten checkmate. Let's take a look at the same position, except this time it's Black to move. In open positions, bishops are generally far stronger than knights. With Black to move, can you see how Black can remove White's light-squared bishop in exchange for a knight? That's right, knight to b4. Black forks the queen and bishop. After the queen moves to safety, Black will trade the knight for White's powerful light-squared bishop. Notice how the knight move also opens up Black's light-squared bishop, joining the other bishop in pointing directly at the king side. Since Black will have a pair of bishops in an open position, Black will have the better chances. In closed positions, the pawns are mostly fixed in place, blocking one another. There are little to no open lines to use, so the game becomes more positional, where pieces have to maneuver around to find good squares. Take a look at this position. It is a very closed game. Almost all of the pawns block each other, so it is very hard to open lines. Notice that the only open line is the b-file, which White's rook on b1 currently controls. In closed positions, knights can be very powerful because they can jump over pawns and other pieces. Bishops are usually not as strong because, as we saw in the previous example, bishops love open diagonals. With White to move, can you find a way to trade Black's knight for a bishop? That's right, with bishop to b5. White's bishop pins the knight to the queen, preparing to enter a good knight versus a bad bishop endgame. If Black's queen steps out of the way, with queen to d8, White removes the knight with bishop takes d7. After queen takes d7, White plays the strong move, knight to c4. White threatens to fork the queen and rook on a8 with knight to b6. Notice the knight also pressures Black's weak pawns on d6 and a5. White's knight is very well placed. Notice how Black's bishop is passively blocked behind its own pawns. Let's say that Black plays rook to a6, preventing the knight fork and still protecting the weak a5 pawn. White will build more pressure on a5 by playing rook to b5, threatening to win the a5 pawn on the next turn. Black plays queen to c7, protecting the pawn and also preparing rook to b8 to fight for the open b-file. Can you find White's next move that completely controls the b-file and brings another piece to the queen side? That's right, rook f to b1. White completely dominates the b-file. White is ready to play rook b7 on the next turn, invading Black's territory. Black's passive pieces are no match for White's active forces. The third type of position is semi-open, which is somewhere in the middle of an open and closed game. In this position, there is only one file open, so this position looks mostly closed. Notice the tension between White's pawn on d4 and Black's pawn on c5. With Black to move, Black can decide to make the position a more open game with c takes d4, opening up at least part of the c file for Black's rook to enjoy. If White plays c takes d4, Black can play rook to c7, preparing to double the rooks on the newly opened c file and complete development with rook f to c8 on the next move. After c takes d4, if White decides to play knight takes d4, trying to keep the c file closed, notice that White no longer has a pawn on d4 controlling e5 and c5. Black can now activate the knight with knight to c5, attacking White's light-squared bishop and fighting for control of the center. Instead of opening up the position, Black can decide to keep the position mostly closed with c4, attacking White's bishop on d3 and blocking the c-file. This type of position will see a lot of piece maneuvering, with both sides trying to find good squares for their pieces and looking for weaknesses to attack. Finally, Black can also keep things unclear by playing rook f to e8, fighting for the only open file and keeping options available to open or close the position later. In semi-open positions, you have to stay flexible and be prepared for files to open or close, ready for both tactics if the position opens up and positional maneuvering if the position closes. Now that you've learned the differences between open, closed, and semi-open positions, it's your turn to make decisions in these types of positions. Pawns are often the first units that jump into the battle for both sides, fighting for space. As this happens, pawns are often threatened by other pawns and pieces. When a pawn is in danger, we often have several choices. Should we push the pawn, capture the attacker, or just ignore the threat? The answer depends on what is going on in each position. Let's take a look at some examples. Let's take a look at the position after the opening moves e4, and knight f6. Black immediately puts pressure on white's pawn on e4. What should we do about this threat? Should we push the pawn, protect the pawn, or ignore the threat? Well, since this is only the second move of the game, there isn't a stronger threat that can be made, so white should not let black simply take the pawn on e4 with the knight. We can protect the pawn and develop a piece with knight to c3, so this is a reasonable move. It's also important to know that if we can defend and also attack, this is usually the best option. White can push the pawn forward to e5, defending against the knight's threat and attacking the knight at the same time. Let's take a look at another position. In this endgame position, black plays rook to e8, attacking the pawn on e4. White could push the pawn to d3, protecting the pawn, or push the pawn to e5, where it is guarded by the pawn on f4. These moves are fine, but why does white need to react? What if white ignores the threat and plays rook to b1? White activates the rook and is ready to take advantage of black's back rank if black is careless. White realizes the e4 pawn cannot be captured because after rook takes e4, black's rook leaves the back rank wide open, and we have a classic back rank checkmate beginning with rook to b8 check. And after rook e8, rook takes e8 is checkmate. In this case, ignoring a threat because you have a greater threat against your opponent is an excellent strategy. Only react to your opponent's threat if you don't have a stronger threat available. Let's look at another position. In this position, black plays d5, attacking the unprotected pawn on c4. Should white's c4 pawn ignore, push, or capture? Let's look at each option. If white's pawn on c4 stays on that square, ignoring black's threat, black will simply win the pawn on c4 for free unless white brings the rook away from the center and plays rook to c1. Not a terrible choice, but there is a stronger move. If white pushes the pawn to c5, notice that black's bishop on f8 would simply capture the pawn. This leaves us with the option of capturing the d5 pawn. After c takes d5, c takes d5. Both sides have captured pawns, which doesn't make a big change in the position, so it's an okay option. But was that the only way white could capture the pawn? Let's take a look. After d5, did you notice that black's d-pawn passed white's e-pawn on the 5th rank? This allows white a second capturing option. Don't forget en passant. After e takes d6 check, white uses the en passant rule to capture the d-pawn, opening up the e-file for white's rook, creating a discovered check against black's king. After king d7, white can hold on to the extra pawn by setting up a pawn chain with c5. Let's practice finding the best decision: push, capture, or ignore the threat in the following examples. To trade or not to trade? That is the question. It is easy to trade pieces when we gain a more valuable piece from the trade, such as trading a rook for a queen. But how do we know when it is good or bad to trade equal value pieces, such as a pawn for a pawn or a rook for a rook? Let's take a look at a few examples to find out. In this position, it is white to move. Should white trade rooks by trading black's rook on d8? A useful idea to remember when making a decision to capture is to take is a mistake unless it makes your position better or your opponent's position worse. After rook takes d8, rook takes d8. Did capturing black's rook make white's position better? No. White gave up the developed rook on d1 and activated black's rook on a8. Notice black now controls the open d file. White's remaining rook is passively placed on a1. Taking was a mistake as it made white's position worse and improved black's position. Since taking was a mistake, a better idea was to improve the position by playing rook a to c1, improving white's least active piece. Let's look at a slightly different situation. Black plays rook f to e8, attacking the rook on e2 and offering a trade on the e-file. Does trading black's rook make white's position better or worse? As we saw in the last example, giving your opponent control of an important file is not a great idea. How can white increase the pressure on the e-file and threaten a favorable trade? That's right, rook a to e1, supporting the rook on e2 and adding a second attacker against the rook on e8. Black can either trade with rook takes e2 or move to the side. Either way, white gains control of the e-file. After rook e to d8, white can use the e-file to begin attacking targets with rook e7, attacking both f7 and a7 at the same time. Notice if black plays rook to d2, threatening the pawn on a2, white simply plays rook takes a7, winning black's a7 pawn and protecting the pawn on a2. In this position, black wants to castle kingside, but white's bishop on a3 controls the f8 square, preventing black from castling. Notice that black can capture the bishop on a3 with the knight. Should black trade? Absolutely. After knight takes a3, black trades white's annoying bishop, allowing black to improve the position on the next turn by castling. Notice that after white recaptures the knight, with knight takes a3, white's knight finds itself passively placed on the edge of the board. With this trade, black's position improved and made white's position worse. Finally, let's look at an opening example out of the French defense. After e4, e6, this is known as the French defense, d4, and d5, black attacks white's pawn on e4. White has the choice to capture black's pawn on d5. Should white make this trade? Although it is an even trade of pawn for pawn, notice that after e takes d5, black's light-squared bishop that was blocked enjoys the opened h3 to c8 diagonal, so black's position has slightly improved, while white has not gained any clear advantage by trading. For this reason, the move knight to c3, developing a piece, protecting the pawn on e4, and adding pressure to d5 is a more popular option. White can also play e5, pushing the pawn forward and gaining space without trading material. Now that we've studied the pros and cons of trading, it's your turn to practice deciding to trade or not to trade. As you're learning the game, there is so much information to digest. Not only are you learning about ways to gain an advantage and win a game, you're also working on learning the language of chess. If you're not 100% sure what the difference is between notating a check or checkmate, how to notate which rook moves to a square either piece could reach, or if you've never heard of a great move receiving an exclamation mark or a game-losing blunder having a question mark after the move, then this lesson is for you. In this position, white has sacrificed a piece to expose black's king. Let's watch white hunt down black's king as we work on mastering chess notation. White is about to play the powerful pawn move h5 check. We always write the square a pawn moves to, in this case, h5. And since black is in check, we add a plus sign at the end of the move to notate a check. So after white moves the pawn, we write h5 check. Black has only one choice, king h6. White unleashes a great tactical idea. Knight takes e6. When we make a capture, we always write the piece we are going to move, in this case the knight, so a capital N, followed by the capture sign, which is an X, and the square we are going to capture, e6. So after white plays the incredible move, we write knight takes e6. Notice black cannot capture white's knight because by moving the knight, white has discovered the bishop's check against black's king. So after knight takes e6, do you remember what we have to add at the end of the move? That's right, a plus sign, which means check. After knight takes e6 check, black does not want to move the king and allow queen takes g7 checkmate, so black plays g5, blocking the bishop's check. Did you notice that black's pawn moved for the first time in the game, advancing 2 squares and trying to pass white's pawn on h5? This allows white to play the special pawn move en passant, capturing black's g6 pawn like this. How do we notate this move? Since it was a pawn capture, we write the file the capturing pawn is on before the capture, in this case, the H file, and then we write captures, which is an X, then the square we captured, G6. Since this move is en passant, sometimes people prefer to write EP, but this is not required. So after we play en passant, we write H takes G6. And since black cannot escape the checks from white's bishop and rook on H1, we write checkmate, which is the pound sign. It's not every day we see an en passant move delivering checkmate. In this game between Grandmasters Aaron Nimzovich and Alexander Alekin, we are going to see both players castle on opposite sides of the board. With white to move, Nimzovich is about to castle on the king side. Do you remember how to notate kingside castling? There are 2 squares between the king and rook, so we write 0-0. Black is ready to castle queenside. Notice there are 3 squares between black's king and rook on a8, so queenside castling is 0-0-0. Let's take a look at another position. In this position, white is about to develop a piece with knight d2, but since both the b1 and f3 knights can move to that square, what should we do? Since we're moving the knight from the b file, we write knight b to d2. In this position, white wants to activate the rook on a1 and attack black's weak c6 pawn with rook c1. Since both rooks can move to that square, can you correctly notate moving the a1 rook to c1? If you noted that since the rook is on the a file and said rook a to c1, great job! Black wants to protect the c6 pawn by moving a rook to a6. Which rook should black move? If black moves the a8 rook, notice it allows rook d8, checkmate. Black should move the rook on a4. When 2 pieces are on the same file, like in this case, we write the rank of the piece that is going to move. Since we will move the rook on the 4th rank, we write rook 4 to a6. When you are reviewing a game that has been analyzed with notes by a player known as an annotator, You may see notation marks after certain moves that suggest the strength of a move. You may see a brilliant move, a game-losing blunder, or something in between. Let's review some of these common annotation symbols from an analyzed game. In this position, white storms the queenside with a4, threatening to trap black's bishop with a5. Black should play a5, blocking white's a-pawn. Instead, black plays a6, which turns out to be a serious mistake. When a particularly bad move is played, an annotator may add a question mark to the move, meaning it is a mistake. This was black's 12th move in the game, so you would see 12, a6, question mark. Why is this move such a mistake? After bishop takes c6, b takes c6, can you find white's powerful move that will completely shut out black's dark-squared bishop from the game? If you found a5, well done. This is an excellent move which completely shuts out black's bishop. When an excellent move is played, like this one, an exclamation point can be added to the move, so we would see 14, a5, exclamation point. Notice after bishop a7, black's bishop is blocked by both white's queen pawns and black's own c7 pawn, so white is practically playing a piece up in this game. In this sharp position, black's next move may mean the difference between winning and losing the game. What would you play in this position? If you found the powerful move queen h4 check, great job. White's king is forced to the first rank. After king g1, black is ready to promote to a second queen, which we notate just like a normal pawn move, writing the square it will move to, in this case b1, and then writing an equal sign, followed by the piece we will turn the pawn into with promotion. So b1 equals queen. And since white is in check, we add a plus to the end of the move. After black's accurate play, white cannot avoid checkmate. Let's flip the board around and think about the position from white's perspective. Instead of playing the excellent queen h4 move, it looks natural to immediately promote the pawn with b1 equals queen. We could add a question mark, meaning this is a mistake. When a player makes a game-losing move, also known as a blunder, sometimes you will see two question marks after the move, like this. Can you see why an annotator may give this move two question marks? Pause the video and see if you can find white's game-winning move. Black appears to be winning, but if you found the incredible h8 equals queen, fantastic work. Black's king is forced to capture the newly promoted queen with king takes h8. Now that the king no longer protects h6, white is able to deliver a forced checkmate, starting with queen h6 check, king g8, queen h7 check. White's bishop protects the queen, forcing black to play king f8. When white wins the game with queen h8, checkmate. We just learned that a game-losing blunder can be given two question marks. Now we are going to see when an absolutely brilliant move can be given two exclamation points. Grandmaster Siegbert Tarash, with the white pieces, finds a brilliant move to finish this game. Feel free to pause the video and see if you can find the move, but don't feel bad if you can't find it. Tarash played the incredibly surprising and powerful move, bishop c7. Imagine the shock of seeing this move played against you. You may think this move deserves one or two question marks as it looks like it just drops a bishop. But this is a move many annotators have awarded two exclamation points, which means it is considered a brilliant move. Not only is bishop c7 the strongest move that forces checkmate, it is also a surprising move. White is threatening both queen b7 and rook takes c5, checkmate. If black plays queen takes c7, white has the powerful move rook takes c5 check, which forces black to give up protection of the key b7 square after queen takes c5. White has the crushing move queen b7 check, with checkmate to follow on the next move. Black's other option is to play rook takes c7. If white could safely play rook takes c5, the position would be checkmate. Can you find a stunning queen sacrifice to distract the rook from protecting the c5 pawn? That's right. White can play queen b7 check. If black plays king takes a5, a rook check on the a file will force checkmate. And if black plays rook takes b7, white delivers checkmate with rook takes c5. When a game is over, is there a symbol we can use to know the result of the game? Yes, there is. If white wins the game, we write 1-0. If black wins the game, we write 0-1. If the game is a draw, we write 1/2 to 1/2. You've been doing a great job mastering chess notation. Let's take a look at one more example together. Finally, annotators use symbols to describe interesting and dubious moves. In this typical French defense position, black's most common move is knight c6, adding pressure to the key d4 square. Moves that may look surprising to you or are not obvious can be considered interesting if the move itself is a sound, sensible move that does not harm the position. One interesting move in this position is queen b6. Moving your queen out early is generally not a good idea, but here it is an interesting move which adds pressure to the d4 square. To notate an interesting move, we would write queen b6 and then add the interesting symbol, which is an exclamation point followed by a question mark. Notice if white plays bishop e3, developing a piece and adding another defender to d4, this is actually a blunder because black can win material with queen takes b2. If black plays c takes d4, this move is considered dubious, so we'd add the dubious symbol, a question mark followed by an exclamation point. This move is dubious because after c takes d4, although black's position is by no means losing, notice after the trade of pawns black no longer has pressure on the d4 square, and since white no longer has a pawn on c3, white's knight can develop to that excellent square, which was not an option before black's dubious pawn capture. Have you mastered chess notation? Let's prove it in the challenges.